Okay, I'm going to go over the Aristotle's rules for validity. So what these rules are going to do is you're going to use the rules to check an argument to see if it's valid or invalid. And I'm going to start just with the common famous argument here, the simple one. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, the first thing we got to do is we got to put this thing into logical form if it's not in logical form. So with the first premise, we have all men are mortal. So what I would do is I'm just going to put the subject term and the predicate term into brackets. So I have all men are mortal. The subject term is men, and mortal is the predicate term. I can also say all men are that which are mortal. Okay, but it's not necessary here. Then we have Socrates is a man. This is what's called a singular proposition because Socrates is one person. He's an actual person that existed. Okay, and if there is let's say there's an actual town that existed, or there's an actual dog that existed, like your dog, like a dog named Fido. Okay, if we have those type of things in our proposition, then it would turn into a singular proposition. So Socrates is a man is actually an a statement because there's one Socrates and we're talking about all of Socrates. So this right here would be all. All Socrates is a man. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the subject term and the predicate term into brackets. So let me clear this up here. So all Socrates is a man. Now my conclusion. Therefore, remember, therefore is a conclusion indicator. Okay, it's a word that indicates there's a conclusion. We have it again. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. In order to put this in logical form, what do I have to add? I have to add the quantity, which would be all. Okay, so therefore, instead of using therefore, I'm just going to use the word so, because it means the same thing. It's shorter to write. So, all Socrates is mortal. And I'm going to put Socrates, my subject term, in brackets, and I'm putting mortal in brackets. So now I can clearly see from the conclusion. Remember, the conclusion is the most important part of the syllogism, because that's going to tell you everything. Socrates is the subject term. Okay. Mortal is the predicate term. Okay. So this right here, the conclusion is this is the way more important than the premises at this point, because these are going to indicate what the premises are. So if Socrates is the subject term, that means wherever I find Socrates, okay, wherever I find it, it's going to be the minor premise, because the subject term of the conclusion is also known as the minor term. Okay, this is the minor term. And the predicate term of the conclusion is the major term. So wherever I find mortal, which is up here, that means that's going to be the major premise. So those are the preliminaries. You need to understand that before you can start testing this argument for validity. Okay, so minor premise, minor term, major term. Okay, so if I find the minor term right here, that means this is the minor premise. So what's the other word over here? If this is the minor premise, you should be able to find what that word is. This other term is going to be the middle term. You need to know that. Okay, the middle term occurs 2 times in the premises. Okay, it occurs right here and it occurs right here, and the middle term is not in the conclusion. Okay, so now I'm going to go over these rules of validity from Aristotle, and what we have to know is what we have to keep in our mind or have a chart of it is the distribution. What terms are distributed and what terms are undistributed. So for rule number one, the first rule is very simple. You can only have you can't have four terms. You can only have three terms. Okay, three and only three terms. Every syllogism can only have three terms. All right, so we have, let's just count the terms to see if this is going to be valid. It has to pass this rule in order to be valid. So we have men, man, same thing. This is the same term right here. They're just different number. And then we have mortal. That's the second term, occurs here. Then we have Socrates. So this argument passes rule number one. It only has three terms. Okay, if it had more than three terms, then it wouldn't be valid. Okay, it would be committing the fallacy of four terms. Or if one of these terms was used in a different sense, then it would not be valid. Okay, we would have ambiguity going on. Like if I was referring to Socrates the philosopher here, and then in this one I was referring to some other person that's alive today named Socrates. Okay, then that would be really four terms. Okay, because it would be two different people. So the second rule is the syllogism. This is another easy one. The syllogism must have three propositions. Can only have three propositions. 1, 2, 3. Remember, a proposition is just a declarative sentence. All right, so we have three propositions here. All right, so that's another simple one. And then rule number 3 is the middle term must be distributed at least once. So this one requires that you know what the middle term is. All right, I already pointed it out. This one's the minor term. Let me write that. This is the minor term. Why is it the minor term? Because it indicates the minor premise. This one's the major term. Okay, so as soon as I find the minor premise right here, that means Socrates is the minor. This is the minor term. Okay, and the other term must be the middle term. All right, so this is the middle term. I'm just going to put an M over the middle term. Okay, now we have to determine if this thing is distributed, because it must be distributed at least once, okay, in order for this thing to be valid. We see here for an A proposition, okay, for an A proposition, if you have a chart already, or if you've memorized this already, a chart on distribution, and you refer to that, you will clearly see that for an A proposition, which this is, that the subject term is distributed. Okay, so our middle term, which is the subject term of an A proposition, is distributed. So this argument passes the third rule. It passes the third rule. If we quickly notice over here, though, it already passed, so I'm done. I'm done with that rule. Okay, but I'm just going to show you this to let you know what it looks like when it's not distributed. Look at this proposition right here, this A proposition. Where is the middle term? Here. It's right here. All right, this is the middle term. Now, in this A proposition, is the middle term distributed? No, it's not. Because the subject term, the predicate term in an A proposition is undistributed. Okay, so in this proposition, it's not distributed. But all that we need to pass this rule is that the middle term is distributed just once in the premises, and it's distributed here. So it's good. It passes the rule. Okay. Now, here is, I'm just going to read this rule number 4 from Socratic logic, because I am going to state it a bit different than how it's stated in the book. Rule number 4 says that no term that is undistributed in the premise may be distributed in the conclusion. No term that is undistributed in the premise may be distributed in the conclusion. How I think about this, and I think it's an easier way to think about it, is this. So I'm going to state it a little different right now. If you have a term that is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premise. Wherever it's found, it must be distributed. Because remember, distributed means universal. So I just want you to think about this. I want you to think about why that's the case. Why, in order to have a valid argument, if there's a term distributed or universal, a term is being universal in the conclusion, why it would have to be used in a universal way in the premise. Okay? If you say something, you say an argument, and your conclusion has a term that's universal, you are saying a lot about something. Okay, you're making a very general statement somehow, because the term is, you're using a term that's universal. Okay, so if you're saying a conclusion that is very general and very universal, if your conclusion is like that, then it only makes sense that you've used that term in the premise. Remember, the premises are the reason for your argument. So it only makes sense that the reasons you're using, that you're using that term universally as well. Okay? It wouldn't make sense if you say very little in the premises. In other words, your premises are, your reasons are very narrow, and then you give some general conclusion. Right? If let's say that you walk around and you see a chair, it's blue, and then you go see another chair, it's blue, and then you say, oh, all chairs are blue. Right? That's some bad reasoning right there. Okay? Because your premises were just way too narrow. That's what's going on. If you have a term in the conclusion and it's distributed, but it's not distributed in the premises. Let's check these. So we have Socrates, which is a minor term. Now the question is it distributed in the conclusion? Yes, it is. Socrates is distributed in the conclusion. Okay, because the subject term of an A proposition, which this is distributed. Okay, so we have to be on alert now. Now we have to make sure this thing is distributed in the premises somewhere. It's right here. Is it distributed here? Yes, it is, because this is an A proposition and it's a subject term and it's distributed. So we pass that. But now we have to check the other term. Look at this term right here, mortal, the major term. Is it distributed? Mortal. Okay, in an A proposition. Now, if you're still confused about the proposition distribution, you could just look on the bottom of page 245. This is right after your page 243 where you see the rules of validity. And you'll see another chart with the distribution. Okay? So you could just look there if you're confused on what I'm saying right now. This term right here in an A proposition, it has a little d, it has a u. If you look at that chart on the bottom of page 245, it has a u because it's undistributed. Okay, it's undistributed. So I don't need to check anything else. It's undistributed. If it's undistributed in the conclusion, I don't have to see if it's distributed in the premises, because I'm not saying something universal with this term. Okay, so this argument passes rule number 4. Okay, because all rule number 4 is telling you is if you have something distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. And we do have something distributed in the conclusion, Socrates, but it's also distributed in the premise. So we're good. Okay. So if we look at rule number 5, it says, no syllogism can have two negative premises. Okay, if you have two negative premises, in other words, your premises, both of them say not or no, or something is negative, something's denied, then you're not really saying anything. Okay, if you have two denials, how can you make a positive conclusion? Or if you really went absurd and you have two denials, then you make another denial, how can those be connected? Okay, so if I had two negative premises, nothing follows from that. Do I have two negative premises here? No. I have one premise right here. It's affirmative. Affirmative is another word for positive. Then I have the second premise here. It's affirmative. So this argument passes that rule. Rule number 6. If one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Okay, do we have one premise that's negative with this argument? No, we don't. But if we did have a premise that was negative, the conclusion must be negative. And also, in that same rule number 6, if the conclusion is negative, one premise must be negative. So if you have a conclusion that is negative, one of the premises must be negative. Do we have a conclusion that's negative here? No. So we don't have to worry about a premise being negative. And those are the 6 rules for testing if an argument is valid or invalid. So what we would say after the argument passed all those 6 rules is we would say this argument is valid. In other words, this argument has good form.